They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But mine was served with a side of champagne and a view of the Eiffel Tower. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was sipping wine in a Parisian cafe, my former colleagues were probably wondering why their quarterly reports suddenly looked like abstract art. I suppose I should start from the beginning, though the real story begins with my resignation letter, or rather, what I didn't include in it. My name is Natalie Brooks, and 6 months ago, I was a senior financial analyst at Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized consulting firm in downtown Chicago. I was good at my job, maybe too good. I could spot discrepancies in spreadsheets like a hawk spots prey, and I had an uncanny ability to predict market trends that made my boss look like a genius. The problem was, he was taking all the credit. Marcus Thornfield was the kind of man who wore his mediocrity like a badge of honor while climbing the corporate ladder on the backs of others. He had perfectly styled hair, expensive suits, and the moral compass of a broken weather vane. For 3 years, I watched him present my analyses to the board, my strategies to clients, and my innovations to senior management, all while I remained conveniently unnamed in the shadows. The final straw came during the Henderson project. I'd spent weeks developing a comprehensive restructuring plan that would save Henderson Industries millions. The presentation was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and I'd worked until 3 a.m. perfecting every slide, every calculation, every contingency plan. Marcus was supposed to present it alongside me. But when Thursday arrived, I found myself mysteriously uninvited to the meeting. "Last-minute change, Natalie," Marcus said, not even bothering to look up from his coffee. "The client specifically requested a more streamlined presentation. You understand?" I understood perfectly. I understood that he was about to steal another 18 months of my work and probably get promoted for it. And I was right. The Henderson project was a massive success, landing Morrison & Associates a multi-million-dollar contract. Marcus got his promotion to senior partner, a corner office, and a 20% raise. I got a fruit basket with a note thanking me for being such a team player. That's when I started planning my exit strategy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The idea came to me during one of Marcus's insufferable Monday morning meetings. He was droning on about synergistic solutions and paradigm shifts. When I realized something beautiful, Marcus couldn't actually do any of the work he claimed credit for. He was utterly dependent on me, and he had no idea how much. Over the past 3 years, I'd become the invisible backbone of his operation. I managed his client relationships, created his presentations, analyzed his data, and even wrote his emails when he was too busy playing golf with potential clients. Marcus was essentially a very expensive figurehead, and I was the puppet master pulling all the strings. So I decided to cut them. My resignation was surgical in its precision. I gave exactly 2 weeks' notice, as required by company policy. I was professional, cordial, and gave no indication of the chaos I was about to unleash. Marcus barely looked up when I handed him my letter. "Finally ready to start that family. Hey, Natalie," he said with a condescending smile. "Don't worry. We'll find someone to fill your shoes." I smiled back. "I'm sure you will." What Marcus didn't know was that I'd spent the previous 6 months meticulously documenting every single one of his failures, every instance of credit theft, every time he'd thrown a subordinate under the bus to save his own skin. I had emails, recorded conversations, time-stamped documents, and a paper trail that would make a forensic accountant weep with joy. But I didn't plan to use any of it. That would be too simple, too immediate. Instead, I was going to let Marcus destroy himself. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't delete files or corrupt data. I simply removed myself from the equation and watched as Marcus's house of cards began to collapse under the weight of his own incompetence. On my last day, I had a brief transition meeting with Amy Chen, my young and eager replacement. She was fresh out of Northwestern with an MBA and the kind of optimism that hadn't yet been crushed by corporate reality. I felt genuinely sorry for her, but I also saw an opportunity. "Marcus can be a bit demanding," I told her during our handover. "But he's also quite particular about his methods. Whatever you do, don't try to improve upon his systems. He doesn't like initiative. Amy nodded enthusiastically. I understand. I'll follow his lead completely. Perfect. I left Morrison and Associates on a Friday afternoon with a box of personal belongings and a one-way ticket to Paris. By Monday morning, I was sitting in a cafe in Montmartre, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and pink, while half a world away, Marcus was probably wondering why his computer seemed to have forgotten how to work. The first sign of trouble came exactly 1 week after my departure. I was exploring the Louvre when my phone buzzed with a message from my friend Kelly, who still worked at Morrison and Associates. Holy shit, Nat! The text read, Marcus just presented the quarterly analysis to the board and the numbers were completely wrong. Like, spectacularly wrong. He's in damage control mode. I smiled and continued admiring the Mona Lisa. She seemed to be smiling back. The thing about Marcus was that he'd never actually learned to use the sophisticated financial modeling software that I'd implemented. He'd always relied on me to run the analyses and then simply memorize the key talking points. But the software required constant updates, calibrations, and data inputs that he didn't understand. Without me there to manage it, the program had been running on outdated parameters for a week, generating increasingly inaccurate projections. By week 2, I was in Barcelona, learning to make paella from a charming local chef named Carlos, when Kelly's updates became increasingly frantic. The Patterson account is furious, she wrote. Marcus gave them a presentation based on last quarter's data because he couldn't figure out how to update the system. They're threatening to pull their contract. I sipped my sangria and watched the Mediterranean sunset. Revenge, I decided, tasted like Spanish wine and validation. The Patterson account was worth $2. $3 million annually. And it was one of the accounts I'd personally nurtured for over 2 years. I'd built a relationship with their CFO, Patricia Williams, based on trust and consistently accurate financial insights. Marcus had met Patricia exactly twice, both times at company social events where I'd done all the actual talking while he networked with other executives. Without me there to manage the relationship and provide the detailed analyses Patricia had come to expect, Marcus was flying blind. And from what Kelly told me, it showed. He tried to wing it through the presentation, Kelly reported. But when Patricia started asking specific questions about the market projections, Marcus kept deflecting to broader strategic considerations and holistic approaches. She saw right through it. By week 3, I was in Prague, marveling at the architecture and receiving increasingly desperate emails from Marcus himself. Natalie, his first email read, I hope you're enjoying your travels. I was wondering if you might have a few minutes to consult on the Henderson follow-up proposal. Just a quick review of the numbers. I'll make it worth your while. I deleted the email without responding and ordered another Czech beer. His second email arrived 2 days later, less friendly, but more desperate. Natalie, I really need your input on the Henderson project. Amy is having trouble understanding your old filing system. Could you provide some guidance? I was beginning to see the bigger picture. Amy, despite her MBA and enthusiasm, was discovering that Marcus's methods were actually just chaos held together by my organizational skills. All those systems he'd claimed credit for, they were entirely dependent on institutional knowledge that had walked out the door with me. The third email came a week later, and the desperation was palpable. Natalie, Morrison and Associates is prepared to offer you a consulting contract for project transition support. Please call me at your earliest convenience. I screenshot the email and sent it to Kelly with a laughing emoji. By week 4, I was in Vienna, attending a Mozart concert in a palace that had been built centuries before Marcus was even a possibility. When Kelly called me directly, Nat, you need to hear this, she said, barely able to contain her excitement. Marcus just got called into senior management. Apparently, the Henderson client is asking for a full audit of their project because they found discrepancies in the follow-up analysis. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The Henderson project was Marcus's crowning achievement, the work that had earned him his promotion and corner office. But it was also entirely my work. and I'd been very careful about how I'd structured it. The initial analysis, the one that had won the contract, was flawless. I'd triple-checked every calculation, verified every assumption, and stress-tested every scenario. It was some of the best work I'd ever done. But the follow-up analysis that Amy had prepared under Marcus's guidance was a disaster. Amy, following my advice to stick strictly to Marcus's methods, had used his preferred shortcuts and approximations. The problem was, Marcus's methods were terrible. They worked for simple projects, but the Henderson account required sophisticated modeling that Marcus had never truly understood. He'd always relied on me to do the heavy lifting and then simplified my work into digestible talking points, without me there to correct his errors and compensate for his shortcuts. Amy had produced an analysis that contradicted the original projections in several key areas. And Henderson Industries, being a sophisticated client, had noticed immediately. They're questioning everything now. Kelly continued. If the follow-up analysis is wrong, how can they trust the original analysis? They want to see all the supporting documentation, all the raw data, all the modeling assumptions. I felt a warm glow of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the Austrian wine I was drinking. The supporting documentation was, of course, impeccable. Every calculation was documented, every assumption was justified, and every model was transparent. But there was one small problem. Marcus had no idea how any of it worked. I'd built the Henderson analysis using advanced statistical modeling techniques that I'd learned in graduate school. The math was sound, but it required a deep understanding of econometric theory and financial modeling principles that Marcus had never bothered to learn. He'd always been content to let me handle the technical details while he focused on the client relationship and strategic vision. Now, faced with Henderson's technical questions about variance analysis, regression coefficients, and model validation, Marcus was completely out of his depth. And Amy, despite her MBA, didn't have the experience to defend work she hadn't created. Week 5 found me in the Swiss Alps, skiing down pristine slopes while Marcus's world continued to crumble. Kelly's updates were coming daily now, each one more satisfying than the last. Henderson pulled their contract, she reported. They're demanding a full refund of their consulting fees. But that's not even the worst part. Word is getting around to other clients. The Patterson account is asking for a review of all their previous analyses. I paused in my descent to take in the breathtaking mountain vista. Sometimes, I reflected, justice was as beautiful as a Swiss sunrise. The Patterson situation was particularly delicious because it exposed another layer of Marcus's incompetence. I'd been managing their account for 2 years, but Marcus had been taking credit for the relationship. When Patricia Williams started asking pointed questions about the methodology behind their previous reports, Marcus couldn't answer them. He actually tried to tell her that the technical details weren't important. Kelly laughed. Patricia has a doctorate in economics. She wasn't buying it. By week 6, I was in Rome, throwing coins into the Trevi fountain and making wishes that were already coming true. Marcus's emails had stopped, but Kelly's updates continued. There's talk of a full internal audit, she reported. Senior management is reviewing all of Marcus's client relationships. They're also asking questions about his previous work, trying to figure out how much of it was actually his. This was the moment I'd been building toward. Marcus's entire career at Morrison & Associates was built on a foundation of stolen credit and delegated responsibility. Every major success he'd claimed was actually the result of my work. And now that I was gone, the truth was becoming impossible to hide. The internal audit was particularly threatening because Marcus had never bothered to learn the details of the work he'd been presenting. He could deliver a polished presentation and charm clients over dinner, but he couldn't explain the technical methodology behind his conclusions. And in a consulting firm, methodology was everything. Week 7 brought me to Florence, where I stood in the Uffizi Gallery, contemplating Botticelli's Birth of Venus, while contemplating the death of Marcus's career. Kelly's latest update was a masterpiece of corporate drama. They brought in an external auditor, she wrote, a specialist in financial consulting practices. She's reviewing all of Marcus's work from the past 3 years. All of it, Nat, every report, every analysis, every presentation. I smiled at Venus, and she seemed to smile back. Sometimes the universe had a sense of humor. The external auditor was Dr. Margaret Foster, a former SEC investigator who specialized in financial fraud and professional misconduct. I'd actually met her at a conference 2 years earlier, where she'd complimented my presentation on risk assessment methodologies. She was thorough, relentless, and had a reputation for uncovering truth that others preferred to keep buried. What Dr. Foster would discover was a 3-year pattern of Marcus claiming credit for work he hadn't done, couldn't explain, and didn't understand. The digital paper trail was extensive, emails where I'd sent him completed analyses, timestamps showing when documents were created versus when they were presented, and version histories that revealed the true authorship of every major deliverable. But the most damning evidence was the quality difference between the work produced when I was there versus the work produced after I left. It was like comparing a Michelin-starred restaurant to a fast food drive-thru. The contrast was so stark that it raised obvious questions about who had actually been responsible for the previous successes. Week 8 found me in the Greek islands, learning to sail in the Aegean Sea while Marcus's ship was sinking back in Chicago. Kelly's updates had taken on the breathless quality of a sports commentator calling a championship game. The Patterson account isn't just leaving, she reported. They're filing a complaint with the Better Business Bureau. They're claiming that Marcus misrepresented his qualifications and experience. They want damages. I adjusted my sail and caught a perfect wind. Sometimes timing was everything. The complaint was devastating because it was entirely factual. Marcus had indeed misrepresented his role in the analyses he'd presented to Patterson. He'd claimed to have developed methodologies that I'd actually created, and he'd presented insights as his own that he'd literally never understood. But the real problem was the precedent it set. If Patterson could prove that Marcus had misrepresented his qualifications, other clients might file similar complaints. And in the consulting world, reputation was everything. A firm that couldn't be trusted to accurately represent its capabilities was a firm that wouldn't survive. By week 9, I was in Turkey, exploring the ancient ruins of Ephesus while Marcus's career was becoming a ruin of its own. Kelly's updates were coming with increasing frequency, each one more dramatic than the last. Morrison & Associates is hemorrhaging clients, she wrote. 3 accounts have canceled their contracts, and 2 more are demanding reassignments. They don't want Marcus anywhere near their projects. I stood in the ancient amphitheater where St. Paul had once preached, and I felt a profound sense of poetic justice. Marcus had spent 3 years building his reputation on borrowed talent, and now the bill was coming due. The reassignment demands were particularly damaging because they suggested that the problem wasn't just with Marcus's recent work, but with his entire professional credibility. When clients specifically requested that a senior partner be removed from their accounts, it sent a clear message to the rest of the firm: Marcus was toxic. Week 10 brought me to Morocco, where I was learning to navigate the souks of Marrakesh while Marcus was learning to navigate the unemployment office. Kelly's final update was brief but satisfying. "He's gone," she wrote. "They asked for his resignation yesterday. The official story is that he's pursuing new opportunities, but everyone knows he was fired. Amy got promoted to his position. She's actually doing really well now that she's not trying to follow his methods. I bought a beautiful hand-woven carpet from a local artisan and had it shipped to my new apartment in Paris. It seemed like the perfect way to celebrate." The epilogue to Marcus's downfall came 2 weeks later, when I received a LinkedIn message from Amy herself. "Natalie," she wrote, "I wanted to thank you for all the systems you put in place. I'm finally understanding how sophisticated your work actually was. I also wanted to apologize for not recognizing it sooner. I've been going through the files, and it's clear that you were responsible for most of the major successes Marcus took credit for. I hope you're enjoying your travels, and I hope you know that your work is finally getting the recognition it deserves." I was sitting in my favorite cafe in Montmartre when I read her message, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and pink. I typed back a simple response: "Thank you. I hope you're enjoying the corner office." 3 months later, I was still traveling. Funded by the generous severance package I'd negotiated and the consulting contracts that had started coming my way through word of mouth. It turned out that clients who had worked with Marcus were very interested in working with the person who had actually done the work. Patricia Williams from Patterson Industries was my first client. She'd figured out who had really been behind the analyses she'd valued so highly, and she wanted to continue the relationship. "I should have known," she told me during our first video call. "The quality of work dropped off so dramatically after you left. It was like someone had replaced a master chef with a short-order cook." I smiled and didn't mention that the comparison was more accurate than she knew. Within 6 months, I had a client base that was generating more revenue than I'd ever made at Morrison & Associates. I was working remotely from whatever city struck my fancy, doing work I loved for clients who valued my expertise. The best part was that I didn't have to do anything unethical or illegal to achieve my revenge. I simply removed myself from a situation where I was being exploited and allowed the natural consequences of Marcus's incompetence to unfold. Marcus, meanwhile, was struggling to find another position. The consulting world was smaller than he'd realized, and word of his departure from Morrison & Associates had spread quickly. His reputation as someone who couldn't deliver on his promises had followed him to every interview. I heard through the grapevine that he'd eventually taken a position at a much smaller firm, at a significantly lower salary, doing work that actually matched his abilities. It was probably the first honest job he'd had in years. As for me, I was living proof that the best revenge wasn't getting even. It was getting ahead. I was traveling the world, building a business based on my actual skills and expertise, and working with clients who valued my contributions. Sometimes, the most devastating revenge is simply living well. I'm writing this from a villa in Tuscany, where I'm spending a month working on a major project for a Fortune 500 company. The work is challenging, the client is respectful, and the view from my office window includes rolling hills covered in vineyards. Tomorrow, I'm flying to Tokyo to meet with a potential client who specifically sought me out based on my reputation. Next month, I'll be in Sydney, working with a mining company on a complex financial restructuring. Marcus is probably still in Chicago, trying to explain to potential employers why his most recent position ended so abruptly. I don't wish him ill, exactly, but I also don't feel sorry for him. He made his choices, and now he's living with the consequences. The final irony is that Marcus actually taught me something valuable, though not in the way he intended. He showed me that competence and integrity are rare enough to be valuable, and that building a career on someone else's work is ultimately a losing strategy. He also taught me that the best revenge isn't about destruction, it's about construction. Instead of tearing down his success, I built my own. Instead of exposing his failures, I showcased my achievements. Instead of seeking justice, I created it. And every morning, when I wake up in a new city with the freedom to choose my own projects and clients, I remember that sometimes the best way to get back at someone is to move forward without them. The world is full of opportunities for those who are willing to take them. I quit my job to travel the world, but I found something better than revenge along the way. I found myself. Marcus thought he was using me to build his career. In reality, he was preparing me to build mine.